Ora, bom dia. Bom dia. Pronto, irei começar por falar em português e cumprimentar a audiência e parabenizar esta iniciativa organizada por várias instâncias, portanto não me alongarei mais sobre isso. Portanto, e esta será uma sessão também em que misturaremos o português e o inglês, e só me cabe dizer também agradecer o meu papel nesta sessão, em que me sinto de certa maneira, não de toda a maneira, honrada, quer por dar e portanto moderar a primeira sessão, quer por apresentar as duas pessoas que irão portanto falar nesta sessão e certamente oferecer-nos reflexões aprofundadas. Portanto, e após esta breve introdução em português, e perdoem-me a minha voz que estou um bocadinho constipada, I shall now switch to English, well, because I think our guest speaker doesn't speak Portuguese, as I was saying, not yet. And, well, welcome everybody, and especially our non-Portuguese speaker. Just to say that we have 90 minutes for this session, and of course you all have the biographies and the titles of the presentations, but I would like to, just on a very brief note, just to say that the two presentations, the first one from Tomas Sobotka, who leads the research group on comparative European demography at the Vienna Institute of Demography, among many other things, and he is himself a demographer with already a very interesting, it makes very interesting points that I think will be challenging for our discussion. And he's going to tutor us into understanding childbearing in Europe, and we are looking forward to discover why 1.5 is a number that should be taken into account in what regards low fertility. And on the other note, we all know here at the ICS Nunes de Almeida, with an already long, it's not very fulfilling career and in terms of family sociology, and she has many publications that we all know, has been kind of a mentor and a leader in many areas, and especially I would like to stress the role that she had not only in being almost a pioneer in fertility studies from the point of view of sociology, but also bringing in something that it's not yet very developed in Portugal, but it's very important, sociology of childhood. So I think that she's going to give us the other side of the coin, and on the sunny side of fertility drop, the emergence of childhood, a note of optimism. It's always good for our spirit, and so I think we start very well, so I will give you the word to our speaker, Tomas Sobotka. Please, you have 30 minutes. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Obrigado. Yes, now it's on. Yeah. Because I'll speak English, if I start speaking too quick, and if you have difficulties understanding me, just let me know and I will try to slow down. Maybe I have too many slides, so I can skip some of them if time is short. Thank you very much for inviting me. I will try to give a broad, mostly macro, aggregate level picture of what's happening with European fertility, or what has been happening with European fertility in the last 2 to 3 decades. And I will also try to position Portugal within the broader European and Southern European in particular trends. Sometimes I may not be aware about some details about Portugal, but I guess the conference lasts 2 days, and there will be plenty of scope to discuss detailed trends and developments in Portugal. All right, so this doesn't work. Try to switch it on.
But you have the mouse here.
Okay, yeah, I use the mouse. Then I just do
yes.
it like this.
Scroll. Enter. No, it isn't. Sorry. Page down.
Page down.
Page up.
Page up. Okay.
Okay.
Good.
So it's the manual mode.
I will manage. So when we look at European fertility in the last 3 decades, we can see, or last 25 years to be more precise, we can see 3 big or larger waves where trends were similar across most countries and regions in Europe. First, in the 1990s, after the break of the Iron Curtain, fertility was falling almost everywhere, and that was the period when we have first seen the phenomenon of extreme low fertility rates, especially with many countries entering the period total fertility rates below the levels of 1.3, and that also included some countries in Southern Europe, especially Spain. Then suddenly after the year 2000, there was quite a reversal, and fertility rates started increasing, at least slightly, almost everywhere in Europe, and this recovery was particularly strong in some countries of Central and Eastern Europe. However, Portugal was quite an outlier in this respect, and fertility was falling in Portugal after the year 2000. And then most recently, after 2008, related to the onset of the recent economic recession, fertility started going down again in most countries in Europe, or at least the increase has stopped in most countries, if not really leading to the decline. There was one trend which persisted during the whole period, and that was a continuing shift towards women and men having children ever later in life. We demographers sometimes call it postponement of childbearing, but that's a catchphrase. It doesn't mean that all these births are postponed. Sometimes this means that some of these births are not realized later in life. But we see it that the age at having first child has been increasing continuously throughout the last 25-30 years. What also emerged quite clearly in the last 3 decades is that economic uncertainty in Europe is closely linked to fertility, and the link is negative. This emerged as an important explanation of low fertility everywhere in Southern Europe, because most Southern European societies have seen a persistence of relatively high unemployment rates and more disadvantaged position of young adults on the labor market. For instance, in Spain there was this discussion about the insider-outsider labor market, where middle generations still had protected contracts, and it was difficult to fire middle-aged workers, but young adults didn't have any such shelter and protection and faced much more uncertain circumstances. And that obviously had some effects on family formation and fertility as well. We have seen a continuing shifts in values, family life, gender relations, and education, and I should mention also a huge European convergence in labor force participation of women. Some 2-3 decades ago, Europe was quite divided, with Nordic countries having very high labor force participation rates of women, many Eastern European countries as well, but Southern Europe largely lagging behind Germany, Switzerland, Austria as well. This is not true anymore. Now, about 75 to 80% of women of productive age in Europe, at least after age 25, after they finish education, they are participating in the labor force, and Europe is no longer differentiated in that. So Southern Europe has broadly caught up with the rest of Europe in this respect. What also emerged quite clearly are worries about too low birth rates and different policy responses addressing these worries. The discussion is not really new. I can give an example of Jacques Chirac, at the time French president in 1984, who with a very characteristic exaggeration said, in demographic term, Europe is vanishing and 20 years from now our countries will be empty. Well, For sure, at 2004, Europe was not empty. Europe is not going to be empty in many more decades to come, but that's a nice example of this exaggeration of the potential influences of low fertility. And a more recent example comes from a paper by two economists in Population and Development Review, who said that large parts of Europe are committing gradual demographic suicide. So there is no shortage of such statements and such exaggerations, and they are also coloring and influencing the policy debates which we are having in different countries about low fertility. Now, what I will try to do in the next 25 or so minutes is that I will discuss briefly some broader European fertility trends and the shifts to delayed childbearing. I will discuss the effects of the recent economic recession on fertility rates, which is quite prominent everywhere in Southern Europe. I will discuss reproductive preferences, and I was also asked to talk about some of the government responses to low fertility and the ongoing policy debates. But because this topic will be also discussed tomorrow by Angela Lucy Greulich, I will be pretty short on this one. And then at the end I will try to position low fertility in Portugal in a Southern European context. I will use various data, mostly aggregate level, based on Eurostat, Human Fertility Database, National Statistical Offices, and also some of the surveys. When I talk about regions in Europe, I'm distinguishing especially between Western Europe, but looking at it separately from the German-speaking countries, which are quite distinct in their fertility patterns, the Nordic countries, Southern European countries, and then separately the German-speaking countries. Then when I discuss Central Europe, I mean the post-communist countries of Central Europe, such as the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Slovenia. And then I sometimes also discuss Eastern European countries, mostly the post-Soviet republics. So now to talk a little bit about European fertility trends, I start with the figure which may be quite familiar to some of you. It's broadly coming from the European demographic data sheet which we are producing at the Vienna Institute of Demography every 2 years, and I brought a number of these data sheets. They are there on the table, so if you are interested in European demographic trends, feel free to pick them up. And what happened in the last 3 decades is that European fertility trends have gotten quite differentiated alongside Northern Europe and Western Europe on one hand, with relatively high fertility rates. I mean high within the low fertility rates we have everywhere in rich countries. So that means somewhere between 1.7 and 2.1. And the rest of Europe, which includes Southern Europe, German-speaking countries, and Eastern Europe, with period total fertility rates somewhere around 1.4 on average. Let's see if this works. No, it doesn't show anything. So I will just comment. Oh no, wait, now it does. So now you see this differentiation at the end of the observed period quite clearly. For the EU average is somewhere in between, and an interesting trend for Eastern Europe during the recession, fertility has been going up, and that's solely because of Russia and Ukraine, where quite strong pernatalist measures had been enacted after the year 2000, and obviously they had some of the intended effects. So fertility in Russia and Ukraine and also Belarus was increasing quite a bit during the last 10 years or so. Now, showing Portugal and Spain in this trend, it's quite interesting because in 1980 Portugal and Spain have both relatively high fertility within Europe, with this total fertility above 2. And then at the end of the period, especially Portugal ends up as probably the country with probably the lowest period fertility rate in Europe. So there is quite a switch from one position to the next during this period. And I hope I will discuss a little bit more why this happened. Spain was a bit more advanced in this transformation and reached extreme low fertility levels already in the 90s, when fertility in Portugal was still around the EU average at that time. Now, the other prominent trend I've already mentioned is the shift towards having children ever later in life, and this is the mean age of women at the time they have their first child. Portugal was quite low within a European context until the 1980s, when first-time mothers in Portugal were around age 24, and then quite a steady increase started. Now, Portuguese mothers are, on average, more or less as old as Western and Northern European first-time mothers, somewhere between 28, 29 years of age on average. Spain is a little bit extreme in this respect. Spanish first-time mothers are over 30 now on average, and Spain with Switzerland has the oldest or the latest start of parenthood in Europe and possibly also globally. Eastern Europe is a little bit lower in this respect, and interestingly the United States are also considerably lower with 26 years as the average age at having first child. Now, what are the key driving factors and what are some of the consequences of this postponement transition? By and large, the most important factor is the huge expansion of university education, especially among women. In contemporary Europe, being enrolled in education is clearly not compatible with motherhood or parenthood. And for instance, in Portugal, the share of women in the early 30s with university education soared from 13% in 2001 to 31% in 2011, just in 10 years. So it would be difficult for such a trend not to have any impact on postponement of childbearing and on fertility rates. Another trend I already mentioned is the increasing economic uncertainty in young adulthood, and that certainly contributes, according to much of the literature, to the postponement of family formation. What's quite a particularly strong effect in most of Southern Europe, although I don't know much about Portuguese situation, is low affordability of housing. There is quite a lot of literature on Italy and Spain, where the norm is that you need to have your own house, your own apartment or your own house to start a family. Now, this is difficult in societies where housing is very expensive, where young people don't have much of an income, and where rental sector is very underdeveloped. That may not be fully the case in Portugal. As I said, I don't know so much about Portugal. Another trend which has been progressing is, of course, the spread of efficient contraception. So young people have very good control over their fertility. Abortion is now quite widely available, almost anywhere in Western and Southern Europe, despite some of the debates which are still going on, and some of the political parties which try to put forward policies for restricting abortion. And what also changed a little bit in the last 10 years is that the morning after pill, so the pill which can prevent pregnancy after unprotected intercourse, has got to the market somewhere in the early 2000s, I believe. So this gives another power to young people to protect themselves from unwanted pregnancies. There has been a lot of delay in partnership formation in many countries, although not everywhere. And in Southern Europe in general, but less so in Portugal, there is a trend of young people staying ever longer at parental place and moving later and later in life to live with a partner. Again, somehow related to the unaffordable housing, but also to what has been coined as familialism in Southern Europe, where parents are very happy to cater for their kids, cook for them, have them at home even when their kids are already 25 or 30 years old, and their kids obviously like the situation to a large extent as well. There is an important effect of this transition to delayed parenthood on fertility rates, at least on these total fertility rates, which are the most common indicators of fertility. One reason is that simply the births which are postponed in 1 year, for instance 2010, just do not happen in that year. So we observe a shortage of births in that year, and there is a depressing effect on this period total fertility rates. This may not affect the cohort or generational number of children per woman, when we look at women over age 40, how many kids they had in their life. So this shouldn't affect this indicator. However, there is an indirect mechanism that late childbearing increases the risk of infertility and of not realizing the postponed children later in life. So there might be some influence on cohort fertility. How do demographers cope with these so-called tempo effects? One way to cope with this is to compute alternative indicators which are not affected so much by the postponement of childbearing, of fertility. And there are a number of them now available. The other, which is perhaps a better way to deal with that, is looking at the real completed fertility of women who are aged 40 or 45 and looking how many children they had, what's their family size distribution. Of course, the disadvantage of this is that you have to wait longer to see what fertility is. You cannot compute every year this cohort fertility for the women who are now having children in this period. So when we look at one of these adjusted indicators of fertility, and that's the one we use in the European demographic data sheet, which I already mentioned, most countries with very low fertility in Europe come up quite higher, somewhere at 1.5, 1.6, even almost 1.7, and that's also the case of Portugal. So Portuguese fertility suddenly looks quite higher. And countries with higher fertility in Europe typically come yet a little bit higher. So for the EU, the average is 1.8 instead of 1.6. So that's a typical difference between the two indicators. Now when we look at cohorts, we also see that women have considerably higher completed fertility than is the period fertility rate. And the good news, so to speak, is that the projections are that cohort fertility decline will stop in most European countries among women born in the 70s, and in some of them, like in Germany, there are even slight increases projected. But there is a variation. Spain has the lowest cohort fertility rate of 1.4. Portugal is not much above that, and the highest ones in Nordic countries and France, 2 or 2.1. Again, Portugal has shifted from being one of the higher fertility countries in Europe in this respect to being among the lowest ones. Women born in 1960 in Portugal had on average 1.8 or 85 children. Women born in 1979 are projected to have on average only 1.45 children. And similar steep decline is observed actually in a region outside Europe, in East Asia, in countries like Korea, Japan, Singapore. In Europe it's quite unusual, and we see a divide between Nordic countries and Western Europe, which have relatively high and stable cohort fertility. Eastern and Central Europe, where steep declines have been happening, but to a higher level than in Southern Europe. German-speaking countries which are low but stable, and Southern Europe which is declining, where Portugal is a clear example of that, and Spain is very, very similar in this respect. I was also asked to comment on parity differences in fertility, but not to lose time. I would just like to make a point that there is not much difference between low and high fertility countries. Well, not a systematic difference in childlessness. So there are countries with high childlessness and relatively high fertility, like England and Wales, who have quite a polarized pattern, many women having 3 or more kids, many women being childless. And there are countries with low childlessness and low fertility, such as Russia, where many women have only 1 child. So there is quite a lot of differences in this respect, but European countries with low fertility usually share the high proportion of women who have only 1 child. And I think Portugal is very much on this trajectory as well, that there is a sharp increase in the number of women who stop after having 1 child and don't continue to the second one. Now, talking a little bit about the recent influences of the recession, there are some common preconditions for family formation which are considered as important for most of the younger people, and many of them have been affected by the recession in one way or another. Achieving relatively stable employment, that's clearly something where recession has had a strong effect. accumulating resources and achieving or having some suitable housing. This is something what recession has influenced quite a bit as well. And the other factors are much less influenced. Having a stable partner or feeling ready for parenthood, of course, these two things are not very much influenced by the economic recession. Now, I describe here some of the pathways, how the economic recession influences the decisions of younger people about having a child, starting a family. Probably I shouldn't read throughout all of that. Maybe I can mention that unemployment and employment instability is probably the key and the main factor influencing younger people's decisions about having family or having another child. And another thing is that there is now a big generation or a big share of people who are around age 25. They are not in employment, not in education, not in training, and many of them are not even on any unemployment benefits. So that's called needs, and the share of these needs has increased a lot in Southern European countries, especially in Italy and Greece, where it and Spain, where it reaches now between 24 and 29%. Now, to illustrate how fertility trends in terms of total fertility rate changed in Southern Europe, especially during the recession, this is the trend which we observed before 2008, where Portugal is somewhat of an outlier, going down instead of up. Almost everyone was going up at that time, and then suddenly the recession starts, and especially in Southern Europe, perhaps with a slight exception of Italy, there is a sharp downward trend. This is not the case everywhere in Europe. I can show the example of France, where the fertility increase has more or less stopped, but fertility remained high during the recession, and there is no clear decline in that respect. In Portugal and Greece, the decline was very pronounced in the last 5 or 6 years. Now, I tried to put together some list of items of markers of how strongly a recession influenced people's well-being and living standards. I will not read all of them, but I tried to count them and score countries to make some sort of ranking how strongly they were hit by the recession. And quite unsurprisingly, Greece gets the highest score in Europe, followed by Ireland, Italy, Spain, and Portugal. So I call these 5 countries as economically stressed countries in Europe. And then there are some other countries such as Hungary, Denmark, Slovakia, Slovenia, where the count is somewhat lower, but they are also somewhat stressed. So they are less stressed than the Southern European countries and Ireland. So I try to distinguish between these two groups. And, well, call them economically most stressed and economically stressed. And you see the colors I attached to them. When we look at fertility trends, in a simple way, I looked at the OECD countries here in the middle. So those which were most stressed had seen the sharpest declines in fertility on average. So this is not very surprising. The 12 other countries which were not very much affected by the recession didn't see much of a change in fertility rates after 2008 on average. But there is a variation. So for instance, among the economically somewhat stressed countries, Denmark, but also the United States, saw sharp declines in fertility rates, whereas Slovenia even experienced some increases. So the story is not very clear-cut. There are some tendencies which are common to most countries, but there are also some outlying countries which buck the trend to some extent. What is very clear is that there has been very strong declines in fertility rates at young ages after the start of the recession anywhere in Europe, which points out to the mechanism of accelerated postponement of childbearing after the start of the recession. When we look at the European Union as such, fertility rates declined by up to 20% among teenagers, which is really quite a lot in 4 years between 2008 to 12. They declined much less among women in their 20s, and they kept increasing among women after age 30. Now, when we look at Southern European countries and Ireland, so the economically stressed, we see similar trend, but at much lower level. So the declines at teenage years were much more pronounced. The declines were also quite strong among women aged 20 to 35, and only small increases among oldest childbearing women after age 35 were recorded. Now you can say, well, probably there was a decline at early fertility rates already before the recession. So I show you for comparison what happened before the recession. This is a picture of 4 years before the recession for the same countries. In the EU, no change in the 20s and among teenagers. In Southern Europe, even increasing fertility rate among women around age 20 to 25, probably because of increasing number of migrants with early fertility pattern, and strong increases in fertility rates anywhere after age 30. So when you compare these two pictures, you really see that the recession has made a big impact on the timing pattern of childbearing after 2008. And not only in Southern Europe, also in Europe as such. I also tried to look at birth order changes in fertility rates. It seems that in Europe in general, it was first births which declined most, but that wasn't the case in Southern Europe, where second and third births declined faster than first births. And in Portugal, it seems that the second birth rates had been falling most rapidly after the onset of the recession. Now I shift to the topic of reproductive preferences, and I should be brief because time is running out, so I will say very briefly, which is quite an interesting thing, is that whatever part of Europe you look at, when you ask younger women of reproductive age, they typically say they intend to have 2 children and that their family ideal is 2 children. And Southern or Northern Europe are not very much different from Central or Eastern Europe in that respect. Data from 1990s are not very different from the data for 2000s in that respect. And this is also illustrated in ideal family size trends over time, where the variation between different surveys and countries in Europe has gotten much more narrower, and in a typical European country, 60%, 55 to 60% of women say that the ideal family size is 2, and Portugal is very much on the trajectory with about 60% of women saying this. What is unclear for Portugal, and I can only speculate a little bit there, is that recent surveys, recent Eurobarometer survey showed quite some increase in the share of women saying that the ideal family size is 0 or 1. But Eurobarometer has quite a small sample size and is sometimes subject to fluctuations. So I wouldn't really bet on this result, and we need to wait a little bit longer to see whether this is a real result or just a noise in the data. Because the time is short, I will cut the discussion on policies, and we can leave some of that for the discussion later on in this session. The only thing which I would like to mention is that there has been quite some increase in explicit pronatalism in policy discussions everywhere in Europe, and most particularly in Eastern Europe. This poster is from Russia, and it says something like, third birth, triple riches in the third millennium. And it's just a strong propagation for people to have a third child. Putin's pronatalist policies are very much based around supporting people, especially with cash benefits, who are having their second or third child. Similar policies have been enacted in Ukraine, Belarus. There have been debates in many other countries. And, for instance, Belarusian President Lukashenko is making speeches where he says that a good woman should have at least 2, but better at least 3 kids, and that this country can support 30 million people instead of 10 million people. So this is a thing which at some point was perceived as a thing of the past, something which was typical of the Ceausescu era in Romania 3 decades ago, but now it's somehow creeping back in some countries and in some political discussions. And when you looked at the government's opinion on fertility, you see that all governments in countries who have ever experienced very low fertility levels in Europe, all except Switzerland, now say they think their fertility is too low and that their policy is to increase fertility rate, which also says, at least at a proclamatory level, something on quite some pronatalism appearing in Europe. Now, final discussion. Why is fertility so low in Portugal, and how can we position it in a Southern European context? Most of the fertility features of Portugal are shared with the neighboring Spain, and most of the institutional factors clearly contribute to lower and delayed fertility. And I did mention already most of them. So education expansion clearly is an important one. Economic uncertainty clearly another one which matters a lot. Both countries have low government spending on families. So, for instance, both Portugal and Spain, government spent about 1.7% of their budget, no, of the GDP, sorry, on families, whereas the OECD average is 2.6%. There is a strong pro-elderly bias in social spending, which has been described by one of my colleagues. And Portugal was one of the sinners who was particularly bad in that respect, that more and more social spending is allocated towards pensioners, older people, and compared to that, less of the money available or distributed by the government goes to younger people and to families. Portugal has relatively short parental leave, only 120 days, which are fully when the income of parents is fully replaced. And there are very high income inequalities among people in Portugal. Portugal has one of the highest Gini coefficients in income in Europe. Also, unequal gender division of household work between men and women clearly persists in Portugal. The survey I saw for the period about 10 years ago or 7 years ago showed that women are spending on average 320 or 330 minutes a day on unpaid work, mostly in households, men less than 100. That was comparable to Italy and Mexico, and even less than in Poland or in the neighboring Spain. So there is also some social change to be done there. The recession has unfortunately accelerated some of the previous trends negatively affecting fertility rates. I don't need to discuss them again. And as a result, Portuguese fertility is now probably lowest in Europe. And this is clearly a combination of temporary factors, such as education expansion leading to the postponement of childbearing, economic recession, with long-lasting structural and institutional factors, which will probably not go away even if the recession comes to the end eventually, and which means that there is a lot of scope for some policy action which should consider not only families, but also younger people in the pre-family stage who are considering or maybe considering forming a family. Now, not to end up on a negative note, what I would also like to emphasize that the worries about low or extreme low fertility in Europe are often exaggerated. It has been shown by Germany, Switzerland, and many other countries that societies can adapt to low fertility, sometimes quite successfully. Germany has had 4 decades of low or very low fertility, and now is the economically one of the most prospering countries in Europe. Cohort fertility is still well above the period one, so that should be taken into account in different discussions. Migrants do contribute not only to the higher numbers of births, but also to population replacement in many parts of Europe, and that was also the case in Spain and Portugal before the recession. So some of the, so to speak, missing births were simply replaced in a society by many younger migrants coming to Portugal or Spain or Italy at the ages when they were productive and could immediately start contributing to the labor participation. Now, researchers studying fertility rate also increasingly claim that optimal fertility rate may not be around the magic replacement level threshold of 2.1 children per woman. It may be quite lower. My colleagues Strisnik and Lutz claim that this is because of increasing productivity of highly educated people, which will also influence countries' productivity when these highly educated people are in the labor force, and the fact that they are more expensive to train. Another contribution in science suggested that low fertility supports higher consumption and has a positive effect on material standard of living. So perhaps the fears about very low fertility shouldn't be overdone. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you so much for this challenging presentation. I'm certain that many people would like to ask questions, but I think that as we are a little bit behind the schedule, Anna should be I'm going to pass the word on to Anna, and we can have discussion at the end, if everyone agrees.
Pediram para falar, bom dia a todos, pediram para falar em inglês por consideração pelo nosso convidado, e acho que todos percebemos inglês, e assim é nessa língua que eu vou fazer a minha intervenção. Thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. It's a privilege to be here among you, and I would like to obviously to congratulate the organizers. It's a very important platform that is established here between academia and civil society organizations. So it's a pleasure to be here. And when Vanessa convinced me to participate, I thought it was a privilege to make a presentation as a kind of counter-discourse on fertility decline, which is too often depicted as a dark component, a disruptive problem of our European societies. Well, I'm not a demographer, I'm a sociologist, having worked on family, school, and childhood, and I would like to take this opportunity to elaborate on the sunny side, I call it like this, the sunny side of fertility decline. And so my aim is to enrich, to inspire the scientific debates of these 2 days with, of course, a certain perspective on this subject. My starting point is an assessment, is a finding. The dramatic drop of fertility rates is nowadays a dominant theme in the public agenda. For example, in Portugal, more recently with the financial crisis, it has been addressed as a political issue. And and this government suddenly discovered that it was urgent to convince, to encourage families to have children. Curiously, in this dominant discourse, there is a common feature, a kind of a sense of loss, of sadness, of nostalgia, when comparing our present to the past. And it's interesting because the same discourse is elaborated, for example, in relation to school. This is very often, it's exactly put in the same terms. In the so-called traditional societies, there were large parities and stable families and couples. Values and order seemed to be transmitted in a fluent way from one generation to the other. And on the contrary, family nowadays appears to be in crisis, if not eroding or disappearing. Examples to reinforce this view: divorce is dramatically rising, marriage is decreasing, more and more couples, individual, postpone or even exclude procreation or limit to its minimum necessary, one child. In a word, we hear this very often, we live in societies with no values. Sociedades sem valores. And these narratives are mostly based on the description of the evolution of numbers on time series analysis, but for the last 3 or 4 decades. Well, a sociologist should remind that numbers are abstractions that summarize final outputs of a complex and multidimensional chain of practices and values that are carried out, transported, I don't know how to say it in English, transportados, by individuals and groups inserted in unequal social contexts. Of course, all these statistical quantitative reports from reality are extremely important to address the problem. This is not my point. But numbers, in a certain way, are not raw material, are not data. They are constructs. Numbers and figures do not speak for themselves. They answer explicit or implicit theoretical and social questions. Well, so my main objective for today is to bring in another agenda to conversely, let's say in addition, bring in a brief temporal and historical perspective in the long term, not just the 3 or 4 last decades, and to enlighten that time and context matters. It's important to gain distance and depth in this discussion and be attentive to the underground, the social processes, the values and representations, namely on childhood and individual in our Western societies, that ultimately constitute the backstage of the indicators. And the first question I would like to address is this one. Is it reasonable to be nostalgic about the past? Was that the golden age, a golden age that we lost? Well, science has permits to make some statements, empirically based. What we know today, that this ideal past never existed. Family life in pre-modern or ancien régime societies was extremely unstable, precarious, and turbulent. Death was at the center of the private life, as the cemetery was at the center of the village. This is a beautiful image used by one of the French historians that worked on these pre-modern societies. And it's important to stress that infant mortality was devastating. One would need 2 children to produce an adult. And parallel to children, young women mortality due to abortions, to deliveries, to childbirth, or young women morbidity were appalling. This meant that instability and precarity was at the heart of the daily lives of these communities. And sometimes these families were described as famille en miettes. And for those who doubt of these appalling women condition, for example, I would like to take the opportunity to recommend this book by Edward Shorter, A History of Women Bodies, where you have a very interesting and tragic description what was human health 100, 200 years ago, due to childbirth, due to incidents and accidents during their fertile life. The second is concerning that idea that family today is in crisis if not disappearing. Well, big European contemporary surveys on the using the European population shows that the family is always a sphere to which Europeans confer an utmost importance compared to work, friends, religion, leisure, or politics. International surveys reveal the importance of the family as an integrative value. It's a kind of ideological cement, a glue with which everyone agrees family is a very important domain in our lives. The problem, no, not the problem, but the surprise for very often is that family life changed dramatically during last decades. But this doesn't mean that family doesn't exist or is in crisis. We assist to desinstitutionalization, informalization of family life and family course. Family is a kind of work in progress built step by step instead of a linear and a foreseeable destiny. Family includes varied repertoires of practices. And nowadays, conjugality goes together. Conjugality can be lived without marriage, without procreation. Active sexuality can be lived without marriage and without co-residence. So new combinations are possible today, are very frequent today, that didn't exist in the past. So I would like to raise your attention to this fertility drop backstage with especially the new representation of the child, the emergency of childhood as a generational category different from adulthood. That is, in a certain way, the soulmate of fertility decrees. Let's go back to that founding book, that founding work by Philippe Ariès. Philippe Ariès was one of the first historians that called our attention to, for the fact that Le Sentiment de l'Enfance for the first time appeared in 18th century bourgeois families that started to control in very rudimentary ways their fertility. And in these bourgeois families appeared a new representation of the child as a creature, an individual that is different of the adult, because he is vulnerable, he deserves affection and the love of his parents. And this image of the first edition of the book is very interesting because it shows, it's an image of the sentimental, relational family that is turned inside the private space, which is different of the public space. And children, as women, are put inside the home, linked to expressive roles and functions, whereas men are develop their role, their instrumental functions in the public sphere. And this child that is not a small adult, it's an individual on his own, is supposed to grow up in a family or in school. Before this child was put to work as soon as physical capable with the other adults. The child had to work since very early ages in productive activities. Domestic economy and family required children's work. And with modernity, childhood appears linked with schooling. And schooling creates the overlapping of these two representations, the métier d'enfant on one hand and the métier d'élève on the other. For example, child labor is nowadays a crime in European societies, and this didn't happen 100 years ago. And we cannot understand the drop in fertility without this representation of child and childhood linked with schooling. And nowadays we witness the passage from a kind of child mass production, une production en série d'enfants, to a tailor-made child. This is possible, of course, let us remember, by the diffusion of modern means of contraception. And I'm referring to the ones that appear in the 60s, the pill and the intrauterine device. They allow to control the contraceptive pathway, and they permit to separate active sexuality from the risk of pregnancy and abortion, and this marks a historical milestone for women, which we must not forget. People can decide on how many children they want, but not only the quantity of children, but also the calendar of births. How many and when should they be born? Of course, the offer of contraception is not enough to explain its massive diffusion. The interesting question is then, which factors explain the social demand for contraception in our societies? And I would like to mention 4 factors. 1, the decrease of infant mortality. The tragic formula of the past, where death is a common experience associated with children and childhood, comes to an end. Less babies are born, but almost certainly they'll arrive to adulthood. And this equilibrium has completely changed. The death of a newborn or of a child is an intolerable exception, as is the death of a young mother. And these were very common experiences of traditional societies, of that golden age we have lost. On second factor, school and education that strongly mobilizes families. School degrees are thought to promote social mobility. And this is one of the strongest incentives or motives to limitate births. Children studying make them family dependent for many, many more years. Of course, their entrance in the labor market is delayed. So couples and families have less children, certainly. But children are children for a much longer period. And this is important to assert and to address fertility issues. Now, the third factor, new rights for women. The recognition of women's rights, namely sexual and reproductive rights, is a powerful factor to explain this contraception demand. Procreation is no more a biological destiny or a necessity for a woman in a couple. It became a rational choice, among others, negotiated within a personal or a conjugal calendar, in the context of a relational more than an institutional family. And let's not forget men's rights in this domain. Fertility in contemporary societies is not just a female affair. It's a gender affair for women and men. Of course, women progress and success in school, where they are in large advantage compared to men, and their entrance in the labor market are factors in play when coming to the interpretation of fertility dynamics. And fourth factor, and this is let's say the macro and the structural one, the individualization processes that are typical of contemporary secular societies, reflexive societies. Individuals are trained, are encouraged into the search of autonomy and to discover their authenticity in reflexive societies characterized by the end of holistic systems, namely religious systems, which in the past indicated collectively, forever and for all, the boundaries between what was right and wrong, what was the virtue and sin. Nowadays, we recognize the construction of individual biographies in a runaway world, as Ulrich Beck put it. And fertility drop can be interpreted as an illustration of this individualization process, which is an illustration of cultural choices in societies that are our societies today. And I move on to my final remarks. The public agenda too often emphasizes the dark side of fertility drop, almost exclusively. Problems like aging, generational replacement, and it was very interesting what Thomas, authors cited by Thomas in his presentation: demographical suicide, empathy and vanishing European societies. So this seems to be the theme and the tone of the public debate on fertility. However, it's important to highlight representations and values behind these indicators that illustrate complex matrix of cultural choices, namely in regards childhood, that is nowadays perceived as a cultural category, and which reinforces a new representation of the child at the center of the family within individualization processes in reflexive and secular societies, which reinforce women protagonism and citizenship. And this is visible, namely, in regard their power to make their choices concerning reproductive health. Thank you for your attention.
Muito obrigada, Ana, por esta visão sociológica e absolutamente essencial destas questões que estamos a debater. Acho que estamos já em cima do horário. Eu estava à procura do Tomas. Portanto, propunha que o debate se estendesse pelo intervalo. Thomas, I'm going to speak in English also, because Thomas will have to understand me. I was proposing that we will all relax and after your both challenging, different but complementary presentations, we could have a debate and just, give the audience the opportunity to ask questions, and we will shorten our coffee break if necessary. Duarte.
I just want to question you about the Ireland crisis. Okay. What happened in Ireland?
So Ireland was one of the countries where we didn't see much of a fertility decline during the recession. And honestly, I haven't seen any good analyses why Ireland has been quite resisting the trend which took place in most other countries which were so hardly hit by the recession of quite sharp declines. I can mention other countries where the declines are clearly visible. For instance, in the Baltic countries, Latvia was an extreme example because in Latvia the crisis has led to a rise in unemployment from 5 to 20% in about 1 year. And I saw that the birth trends reacted in about 9 or 10 months to the start of these troubles, which is, I can't imagine a shorter time interval. I don't know whether there were some abortions involved in this, but it was really an amazingly quick reaction. Ireland was very, very slow, so the slight fertility increase before the recession has come to the end, so that perhaps was the effect of the recession. And fertility was slowly, slightly declining after that, but not much of a reaction. I don't have a story of that on that.
Okay, another question over there. I don't know if you want to answer right away to each question, or if we can collect just 3 or 4 and then you answer afterwards. I think maybe it's better to organize our debate. So go on, please.
People can speak in Portuguese.
And people can speak in Portuguese, and in any case we will translate.
But I will speak in English. Well, I'm a doctor and I work for the General Directorate of Health and Welfare, and I have a lot of work done with contraception. So there was something that you mentioned that I was just, I couldn't understand if you were saying that it was one of the issues that is being brought to debate.
Mais questões? Para a outra ali, por favor.
Thank you for your presentations. I would like to make or to ask for how do you see in your analytical framework the issue of the uncertainty, because economic necessity as a factor for delaying or drop.
Mais uma questão, Vanessa.
Thank you, Tomas, for your
Bom, uma pergunta, Karin, por favor.
Yes, thank you very much for your presentations. Just a quick question for Anna.
Yes.
When we look at that decline in fertility, we can't help thinking about how childhood developed in Portugal. Would you like to talk a little bit about that? Because I think that the terrible working and living conditions of families very late into the 20th century and the place of childhood in those families was very important to structure values and fertility levels in Portugal. I'd like to hear you a little bit on childhood over time. For Thomas, could you, the Eastern European countries really had a strong decline in fertility, but now they've gone up to what you call that more or less stable level, 1.4, 1.5. How do you explain this development in Eastern European countries? As unemployment is also and gender inequality is very strong in those countries, which are some of the driving factors you mentioned. Why this sort of more or less stable fertility?
Well, maybe two more questions before passing the word on to you, please.
Thank you. Thank you both for your papers. I think the two of them, they fit very well in, and especially the more optimistic paper by Alma just fits in very well with the last part of your presentation, in which Mrs.
Well, we have many questions already. I don't know if there is... No? Well, maybe we can just answer this first round of questions. I don't know if I'm allowed to make a small question for both of you, just to finish. Sure. It was something that I would like to hear if we have the time to comment on one thing that I found I think it's puzzling, and well, probably it demands a multidimensional interpretation. Like, for instance, women's education. Tomas mentioned women's education as a factor, and I think I can understand why. One of the factors underlying the postponing of, well, the birth of the first child. But that I was wondering if that really can explain or be an explanatory factor in some sort of way of the drop in fertility rates. And I think, on one hand, I would like you to comment, for instance, the example of the Nordic countries. The women have a much higher education levels than, for instance, in Portugal, where unfortunately our figures are not brilliant. And so I don't think there's a really clear-cut connection. And on the other hand, don't you think, and this is for kind of both of you to comment, that it might be a little bit dangerous to suggest such a connection in terms of policy implications, because that would mean that, for instance, women wouldn't have the autonomy or the kind of, it's like the right to education. It's like you were saying, and what about men's education? So this is a bit kind of a provocative question, but I was wondering if you can really kind of connect women's education to this factor. And just, I think Anna can explain this much better than I do, but for instance, in Portugal, and I think if maybe you don't know that, but women with kind of higher education normally have more opportunities in the labor market, and also more children than women, for instance, with lower levels of education. So that's a question that I have to do. So thank you, and please, you have lots to talk about. So just 10 minutes for each of you.
Okay. Very much for your questions. Virginia, I totally agree with you. Uncertainty is a clue in this puzzle. Family links nowadays result from conjugal links, not family links, but couples are kind of private commitments negotiated between two people. And the couple life is negotiated and built step by step. It's a kind of work in progress. It's an open experience, daily built. And I agree with you that this the time representation of this experience, this conjugal experience, does not fit into a fertility time representation. A child the project child is a commitment forever. And this contradicts the main, let's say, the main trend of the individualization processes and the encouragement and the mostly and the obligation to discover your own place and your own biography. Yes, I think this is very interesting to explore in research. This commitment in the present to make the present as o mais gratificante possível. How do you say this in English? Effectivamente, fulfilling the emotion, this requirement of the present that contradicts the engagement that the project child implies for all your life. So, yes, I agree that this is a very interesting way to address fertility issues. Childhood in Portugal. Well, Portugal, contrary to other Central or Northern European countries, entered very late in school modernity. Schooling is a conquest of democracy is after 74 that there was the school massification and democratization. And since then, families are very much involved in the educational success of their children. But this is a recent conquest, because before, till the 60s and the 50s, children were very frequently working in the fields. They had 4 years of schooling. Some, very often, they did not conclude the primary school. So they were put to work with their parents, with their family, in the fields, in the communities, in the fields, or in the factories, for example. There are reports of children working in the factories with special tasks, but they were there working with their parents. And so the school massification is a recent conquest. I must say that nowadays, with the crisis, the school project, of course, is not endowment on the basis for the first levels. But in a recent research we undertook here in DCS that resulted from a command from the UNICEF, Children and the Crisis, it was evident and very problematic that even children perceive that future in school as a problem in certain families, in low-income families. And this is really a devastating conclusion after the years of progress that was made in the country concerning the massification of schoolings. There are now families that are revising their school project for their children due to financial constraints. You should not forget this dimension. And so thank you, Karen, for putting that question. Now, Sofia, of course, there is not at all a clear-cut connection between women's education and low fertility. No, it's the opposite in Portugal. And when I mention women's education, I related it to the demand of modern contraception, not in relation to the fertility drop. I mentioned it as a citizenship right that was recent, in Portugal at least. Thomas.
Thank you. So I try to follow all the questions. I hope I will not miss them. Morning after pill and contraception in general. In fact, we know quite a little about the effect of the availability of the morning after pill, and the time I started thinking about it was that in some countries there has been a lot of debate on persistent, relatively high teenage fertility. For instance, in the UK, it was clearly to some extent undesired or unwanted, but obviously a number of teenagers had troubles preventing their pregnancies. And suddenly during the recession time, even in the UK, teenage fertility dropped by about 20% in a few years. And I started thinking, how is that possible? It's very unlikely that young people stopped having sex during the recession. So there must have been something else, and I thought that the availability of morning after pill could be an important factor in that, but that's a speculation. I don't know any data for that.
It's a very important issue, because countries like Poland, for instance, or Malta, they're countries where you don't have abortion, you don't have services for abortion, unless there's a risk of a mother's going to die, and there's no access to modern contraceptives, and there is no access to morning after pill, and they have a total fertility rate which is low, as you know. And if you think about Norwegian and Denmark, countries that have modern contraception, morning after pill, and abortion for many years, they do have
High fertility.
fertility rate.
But not high teenage fertility. That's the thing.
It was just I'm going issue, but I work, and I'm always stressed about this question, as if we do a lot of contraception, or if we allow women to have a safe abortion, probably we are contributing to a lower fertility rate, and it's not true, because we have different countries in Europe that can show us that you can have good access in sexual and reproductive health care, which is right of women, right to choose, and really many women with this don't die of an unwanted pregnancy by doing an abortion, unsafe abortion. So I think it's very, very important to have a very clear idea that we have many examples in Europe that access to modern contraceptives, all of them, and safe abortion does not diminish total fertility rate.
Being from Central and Eastern Europe, I can add that during the socialist period, many governments tried to restrict access to abortion, and arguably there was some effect on fertility rates, especially in the case in Romania, where suddenly...
Just after the fourth child, you have to have 4 children, and then you can have an abortion.
Well, the point I want to make, the point I want to make is that it's a tricky question, because this small success in fertility was at what costs? At the cost of illegal unwanted abortions, at the cost of maternal health and maternal deaths in Romania, at the cost of couples having children they didn't want to have. So I would never argue for any restrictions in this area. Even if there was an evidence that there was some fertility effect, which is of course tricky, of course. About uncertainty, I agree that uncertainty is appearing as a key factor in fertility decisions, and economic uncertainty just adds to the biographical uncertainty which you have discussed. Although with biographical uncertainty, it's not a clear-cut thing whether, for instance, family instability necessarily leads to low fertility, because in many settings, women who are quick to start a new relationship and are still having, for instance, a new partnership at the age when they want to, when they can have a child, having a second or a third partnership can lead to another birth, actually, because some couples want to cement their relationship by having a joint child together. So there is also a slight positive effect of this to fertility.
3 minutes to finish.
Well, that's difficult. So I have to pick up things. I will drop the crisis, the link between delayed childbearing and fertility. I think delayed childbearing didn't reach its limits yet. If couples want to have just 2 kids, and this is what most couples want, they can safely start at 31 or 32, or most of them can safely start at 31 and 32, and almost all of them will achieve their desired family of 2. So we are not yet at the stage when delay of childbearing would be having a clear impact on completed fertility rates in a European comparison. Germany and its adaptation to low fertility, well, that includes a little bit of accepting migration. So Germany is clearly an immigration country in the last 20-30 years. But it's also plenty of other adaptations, all the pension reforms. But one of the important things in Germany, Austria, and Southern Europe is tapping the potential of women to work and contribute to the economy. This has not clearly been done to the extent which is possible, for instance, in Central Europe, but it has been happening in the last 10 or 20 years. Young adults, so many of them are out of work and are not engaged in the labor force. I don't think we need another hundreds of thousands of children to become young adults who are unemployed and not able to find work in the future. Well, last thing which I should pick up, why not education? So education clearly affects the trend towards later childbearing. That's no question about that. Everywhere we look at differences between lower and higher educated couples, higher educated women have children later in life, and there are no exceptions. But as was mentioned, highly educated couples and women don't necessarily have few kids. I don't know the case of Portugal. In the Nordic countries, there is no educational gradient. So highly educated people have more or less the same number of kids as low educated. In most countries, there is a negative educational gradient, but the argument could be made that this is because of the incomplete gender revolution. The societies which saw a lot of educational expansion, women getting ahead in jobs, in education, didn't adapt to this change, and often still want to impose the old order, so to speak, on women and families, and men didn't adapt to this change. If you look at Japan, which has a strong educational gradient in fertility, so women get high education, well, yes, they do. They start having some sort of career, although they are disadvantaged, yes, they do. But when they want to have a child, they are supposed to marry, have a child, probably start cooking for their partners, take full responsibility for the upbringing of the child because their salarymen are working 12 hours a day and they don't have time for that, and be responsible for the child to be the brightest child around in succeeding in the race to have the best education. And that's a task these women are not willing to do anymore, at least not all of them, and it results in low fertility at the end of the day.
Okay, thank you so much. Obrigada. Com um pouco de... pronto, é isso que eu ia dizer, com o coffee break, não sei se me compete, mas tomarei a liberdade de dizer que os trabalhos se reiniciam dentro de 20 minutos, ou seja, recuperando o prazo com que já começámos esta sessão. Não sei se todos estão de acordo, pronto, e a continuação de bons trabalhos. Obrigada.